Today, Transformation by Robert A. Johnson, Understanding the Three Levels of Masculine Consciousness. This is a great book that's helped me a lot, that elaborates on Jungian ideas and practical application of these ideas. Jung's writings can be very wordy a lot, and I find that other people's writings, like Robert Johnson, Edward Edinger is also a good one, and Marie Louise von Franz. These other people kind of elaborate, and this is a very easy read. It's a very short book. Here's the cover. I think I have all of Robert Johnson's books. They're very small, easy to read, fun to go back through and read. So I'll be reading the introduction. Tradition indicates that three levels of consciousness are available to us. Simple consciousness, not often seen in our modern technological world. Complex consciousness, the usual state of educated Western man. And the enlightened state of consciousness, known only to very few individuals, which is the culmination of human evolution and can be attained only by highly motivated people after much work and training. Proverbs in many languages point these three levels of consciousness out. One story, for instance, relates that the simple man comes from home in the evening wondering what's for dinner. The complex man comes home pondering the imponderables of fate, and the enlightened man comes home wondering what's for dinner. Simple man and enlightened man have much in common, including a direct, uncomplicated view of life, and so they react in similar ways. The only true difference between them is that the enlightened man is conscious of his condition, while the simple man is not. Complex man, on the other hand, spends much of his time worrying and is often in a state of anxiety. A Zen Proverb states, "When I was young and free, the mountains were the mountains, the river was the river, the sky was the sky. Then I lost my way, and the mountains were no longer the mountains. The river was no longer the river, and the sky was no longer the sky. Then I attained Satori, the Zen term for enlightenment, and the mountains were again mountains, the river was again the river, and the sky was again the sky." Our biblical tradition takes us from the simple perfection of the Garden of Eden through every imaginable chaos and leads us finally to the heavenly Jerusalem. Again, three levels of consciousness. Our psychological traditions also validate the existence of these three levels. Fritz Kunkel, a psychotherapist who worked in Los Angeles from the 1930s through the 1950s, observed that human beings proceeded from red-blooded to pale-blooded to gold-blooded consciousness, or from simple to superior. This was a simple way of describing the three levels of consciousness open to us. Dr. Esther Harding has pointed out that psychic energy can manifest itself in three ways: as instinct, as ego consciousness, and as investment in the self. Man evolves from acting instinctively to putting his psychic energy under control of his ego. Then he must evolve further to place his psychic energy under the control of the self, that higher consciousness that is variously called God, enlightenment, Satori, or Samadhi. One looks in vain for examples of the man of simple consciousness in our complex Western world. We often project this quality onto dark-skinned minorities and women and then resent them for it. Writing of his experiences at Walden Pond, Thoreau chronicles a complex man's attempt to regain the simplicity of his life. Our own countercultural movement of the 60s was an attempt to restore a simplicity and contact with Mother Earth and natural living. Mahatma Gandhi urged India to retain its simple consciousness. symbolized by the spinning wheel. He would have had every Indian live a simple life, spinning his own cloth, cleaning his own house and latrine, and so on. India nicely sidestepped his advice by isolating Gandhi in its pantheon of saints, and his life has little effect on present-day India. When I first went to India, I had been warned of the horrors I would encounter: lepers, corpses on the street, poverty, maimed children, beggars. All of this was true, and I withstood the impact of this darkness as best I could. I had not been warned, however, of the great happiness of the people. When I saw people who had so little to be happy about living in an unshakable happiness, I was completely thrown. I was witnessing the miracle of the simple man finding happiness in a rich inner world, not in the pursuit of some desired goal. Footnote: there's a fine story about Mother Teresa of Calcutta. A reporter was finally given an interview with a Roman Catholic nun who has made such an impact on India by caring for the poor and dying. Ushered into her simple room, the reporter burst forth, "Isn't it terrible, sister? 10,000 refugees are pouring into Calcutta every day from besieged Bangladesh, and there is no food or housing for them." "No," replied Mother Teresa. "It is wonderful. See, he just took food," pointing to the shriveled youngster in her arms who had just taken a spoonful of milk. A true saint, manifesting in a form of enlightened consciousness, had seen a miracle and found hope and reason to live in that immediate fact. The reporter, quite certainly a man of complex consciousness, was lost in the terror and meaninglessness of the situation around him. Later, I inquired into the origin of the word happy and found that it derives from a word to happen. In other words, happiness is to be found simply from observing what happens. If you cannot be happy at the prospect of lunch, you are not likely to find happiness anywhere. What happens is happiness. Simple man lives in this consciousness and finds happiness in a rich inner world, no matter what the outer circumstances may be. Men of enlightened consciousness know this noble fact and live in a philosophy and an attitude of happiness. For them, happiness bridges the inner world and objective fact. A connection that simple man is not capable of making. Don Quixote, who will be the carrier of the simple man in our inquiry, knows the colorful world of his inner life, his imagination, but he knows it at the expense of outer fact and reality. This way of life is rich and highly durable, but it requires a superior man to maintain it in the face of outer reality. Complex man, lost to the simple attitude of happiness and not yet understanding what God is, remains stranded in his worry, loneliness, and anxiety. A Hindu teacher once told me that the highest form of worship is simply to be happy. This happiness is known only to simple men and enlightened ones. Complex men in between consciousness remains trapped by nostalgia for the past or anticipation of the future that mostly eludes his grasp. Driven from the garden. A whole generation of complex men have been thrilled and vicariously nourished by such books as Zorba the Greek, which portrays a wonderful earthly Greek who experienced the vitality of life in a direct way, and by the novels of Hemingway, whose portrayals of bullfights and heroic living gave nourishment to the pale, office-bound people. Footnote: it was sad to see Hemingway himself fail his own vision and commit suicide when his own bravado was exhausted. Because we have the unjustifiable opinion that complex consciousness is highly desirable, we very carefully educate our young out of their simplicity as early in life as possible. Parents are very proud of their youngsters, are very proud if their youngsters can read and write or gain computer skills at a very, very early age. This often produces children who have been robbed of their childhood and been driven from their Garden of Eden much too early, and who therefore develop neurosis later in life. Societies before the modern era, and those still functioning in less developed parts of the world, believe that most people are to be left permanently in simple consciousness. In the Garden of Eden, unless they give solid proof of their ability to make their way through complex consciousness and go on to higher consciousness. Thus, only a very few precocious individuals are allowed to acquire complex consciousness. Medieval Catholicism is often accused of trying to keep most of its people in a peasant state and allowing education only to those few destined to sainthood or priesthood. The Church censored Galileo for not stating a supposed falsehood, but for speaking the truth to those the Church considered unprepared to hear. Complex consciousness is so highly prized in our society that no cost is thought too high to gain freedom, self-determination, and choice, the qualities of this level of consciousness. We are so zealous in championing complex consciousness that we will export its way of life to any other less advanced country free of charge. Traditional Indian society is based on a caste system that allows only a few superior individuals to gain consciousness. These are the Brahmins, who are the priests, teachers, and mystics of Indian society. The next lower level caste system consists of the rulers and warriors, people less concerned with consciousness. Castes lower than this are the domain of tradesmen and workmen. The system keeps the large majority of people in simple consciousness, with higher consciousness available only to those few individuals whose caste gives indication that they can survive the passage through complex consciousness. This system certainly has its flaws, of course. One of the most severe problems with the caste system is that it is hereditary and therefore does not always designate the individual to a level commensurate with his innate capacity. But overall, it has avoided the mass neurosis prevalent in Western societies. Our modern Western attitude towards consciousness has the great advantage of offering access to higher consciousness to virtually everyone. Anyone wishing to invest the necessary effort in consciousness is given the vantage point of complex consciousness from which to reach toward the highest level. But the difficulty of doing so leaves a large number of people stranded in complex consciousness, unable to proceed to higher consciousness or to return to the simplicity and peace of simple consciousness. Few people have the means or insight to become 20th century Thoreaus, even if they felt this was a viable solution. Dr. Carl Jung warns of attempting, quote, to make a regressive restoration of the persona, quote, to go back to a simpler consciousness when one has discovered the suffering of complex consciousness. Those who try this solution to the suffering of life merely put on a persona of simplicity, which is a further complication of an already overburdened life. Once you have left simple consciousness in favor of complex consciousness, you can never regain the simplicity of the peasant or red-blooded man. Returning to the Garden of Eden is not possible once you have been expelled from it. For, as Scripture informs us, There is an angel with a fiery sword standing there to refuse our return. Put more simply, you can't go home again. In this book, I want to explore the three levels of consciousness, which I have called the two-dimensional man, the three-dimensional man, and the four-dimensional man, as they are portrayed in three works of literature: Cervantes, Shakespeare, and Goethe. They have given us works of art that portray these levels with great power. Cervantes wrote of Don Quixote, a man who was so enamored at the simple ways of two-dimensional man, medieval man, that he took on the finery of knighthood and chivalry and played out a half comic but half inspired imitation of what he had lost in his life. Shakespeare defined complex man with unerring accuracy in Hamlet, and Goethe gave us Faust, which picks up where Hamlet lost the battle and takes us on to that higher consciousness often called redemption. In these three works, we can trace the evolution of consciousness possible in this life. That's the introduction. And next is Chapter 1, The Two-Dimensional Man.